Subscribe to my YouTube channel for deeply emotional, romantic, and mature stories that echo through your heart. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support meaningful storytelling. The last guest had finally left, and the echo of laughter still lingered in the empty house like a ghost of happier times. Sarah stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of what had been a perfect dinner party. Wine glasses stained with lipstick, plates scattered with crumbs, and the faint scent of her signature lasagna still warming the air. But as she began clearing the table, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. David was still there. Her husband's best friend since college sat quietly on the living room couch, his tall frame relaxed against the cushions, his dark eyes watching her with an intensity that made her hands tremble slightly as she stacked the dishes. Michael had already retreated to his study, claiming he had urgent work emails to respond to, a familiar excuse that had become all too common in their 7-year marriage. "You don't have to stay and help," Sarah called out, her voice carrying a nervous edge she hoped David wouldn't notice. "I'm sure you have somewhere else to be." But David didn't move. Instead, he stood slowly, his presence filling the room with an electricity that made Sarah's breath catch. "Actually, Sarah," he said, his voice lower than usual, "I was hoping we could talk." The way he said her name, soft, almost reverent, sent a shiver down her spine. In all the years she'd known David, through countless dinners, holidays, and casual gatherings, he'd never looked at her quite like this. Never spoken to her with such careful intention. "Talk about what?" she asked, though something deep in her chest already knew this conversation would change everything. David took a step closer, and Sarah found herself frozen, a wine glass clutched in her hands like a shield. The distance between them seemed to shrink with each passing second, filled with unspoken words and years of carefully buried feelings. "About us," he whispered. "About what we've both been pretending doesn't exist." Chapter 1. The Weight of Silence 3. Months earlier, Sarah had been a different woman. She'd wake up each morning with purpose, her auburn hair catching the sunlight as she prepared breakfast for Michael, humming softly while she moved around their beautiful suburban kitchen. Their marriage had settled into a comfortable rhythm, or so she'd convinced herself. Michael worked long hours as a corporate lawyer, often leaving before dawn and returning well after dinner. When he was home, he was present in body but absent in spirit, his mind always occupied with cases, clients, and the relentless pursuit of partnership at his firm. Sarah had learned to fill the silence with her own activities, volunteering at the local animal shelter, tending to her garden, and hosting dinner parties that brought life and laughter into their increasingly quiet home. It was during one of these gatherings that she first noticed the way David looked at her. She'd been serving dessert, a homemade tiramisu that had taken her the entire afternoon to perfect, when she caught him watching her from across the room. Not the casual glance of a family friend, but something deeper, more searching. When their eyes met, he didn't look away as he usually did. Instead, he held her gaze for a moment that stretched like warm honey, leaving her feeling exposed and strangely breathless. "Sarah makes the best tiramisu in the state," Michael had announced to the table, his voice carrying the proud but distant tone he used when discussing her accomplishments. "I keep telling her she should open a bakery, but she's too modest." The comment had stung, though Sarah couldn't quite articulate why. Perhaps it was the way Michael spoke about her as if she weren't there, or how he reduced her carefully crafted evening to a simple compliment about dessert. Or maybe it was the way David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when Michael spoke, as if he too felt the casual dismissal in her husband's words. After that evening, Sarah found herself thinking about David more often than she cared to admit. She'd catch herself wondering what he thought about during their dinner conversations, Whether he noticed the new dress she'd worn to their anniversary celebration, or if he could see through the carefully constructed facade of her contentment. David had been Michael's roommate at law school, though he'd chosen a different path after graduation. While Michael climbed the corporate ladder, David had become a high school English teacher, passionate about literature and poetry, in a way that made his eyes light up when he talked about his students. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays, who brought flowers when he came to dinner, and who actually listened when Sarah spoke about her volunteer work or her dreams of traveling to Italy. He was everything Michael had stopped being, and that realization terrified her. The first crack in her carefully maintained composure came during a casual barbecue in early summer. Sarah had been struggling with the grill, cursing under her breath as the flames refused to cooperate, when David appeared beside her with that easy smile that made her feel like she was the only person in the world. "Having trouble with the beast?" he asked, his shoulder brushing against hers as he reached for the tongs. "I think it's plotting against me," Sarah laughed, stepping aside to give him room. "Michael usually handles the grilling, but he got called into the office." The excuse felt hollow even as she said it. Michael had received the call just as their guests were arriving, and rather than postponing his work or asking someone else to handle whatever crisis had emerged, he'd simply kissed her cheek and disappeared into his study. Again, David worked in comfortable silence, his movements efficient and practiced. Sarah found herself watching his hands, strong and gentle, the hands of someone who created rather than just consumed. When he glanced up and caught her staring, she felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the summer sun. "You!" "No," David said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sizzle of the grill. "You deserve someone who shows up." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that neither of them was ready to acknowledge. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she searched for a response, but before she could speak, their other guests called them over to settle a good-natured argument about baseball statistics. The moment passed, but its impact lingered. That night, as Sarah lay beside her sleeping husband, she stared at the ceiling and wondered when she'd stopped feeling like she mattered to the man she'd married. When had Michael stopped seeing her as more than a beautiful accessory to his successful life? And when had David started looking at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been afraid to ask? Chapter 2. The Art of Pretending. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning. Elegant cream cardstock with Sarah's careful calligraphy announcing their 7th wedding anniversary party. Sarah had spent weeks planning every detail, from the menu to the flower arrangements, hoping to recapture some of the magic that had brought her and Michael together in the first place. She'd met Michael during her senior year of college, when she was working part-time at a coffee shop near the law school. He'd been confident and charming, with ambitious dreams, and a way of making her feel like she was part of something important. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of expensive dinners, weekend getaways, and passionate conversations about the future they'd build together. But somewhere along the way, the conversations had stopped. The future they'd planned had become Michael's future, with Sarah playing a supporting role in his carefully orchestrated life. She'd convinced herself that this was what marriage looked like: comfortable, stable, predictable. It wasn't until she started noticing the way David looked at her that she realized how much she'd been settling for. The anniversary party was meant to be a celebration, but as Sarah moved through the preparations, she felt more like an actress preparing for a performance. She chose her dress carefully, a deep blue number that brought out her eyes and hugged her curves in all the right places. She arranged the flowers with artistic precision, set the table with their best china, and prepared a meal that would have impressed the most discerning food critic. Michael, for his part, seemed genuinely pleased with her efforts. He complimented her appearance, thanked her for organizing such a beautiful evening, and played the role of devoted husband with convincing charm. But Sarah could see the performance in his gestures, the way he checked his phone during conversations, the practiced smile he wore when their guests hosted their perfect marriage. David arrived fashionably late, carrying a bottle of wine and a small wrapped package that he handed to Sarah, with a smile that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed facade. "For the hostess," he said, his fingers brushing hers. As he passed her the gift, "I thought you might like it." Inside was a leather-bound journal, the kind used for travel writing, with a note tucked inside the cover. "For all the adventures you're meant to have." Sarah's throat tightened as she read the inscription. The gift was so thoughtful, so perfectly suited to her unspoken dreams of travel and adventure, that she had to excuse herself to the kitchen to compose herself. How did David know about her secret wish to write about her travels? How did he see parts of her that her own husband seemed blind to? Throughout the evening, Sarah found herself hyper-aware of David's presence. She noticed how he helped serve drinks without being asked, how he drew out the quieter guests with genuine interest in their stories, how he seemed to anticipate her needs before she even recognized them herself. When she struggled to open a particularly stubborn bottle of wine, he was there with a corkscrew and a reassuring smile. When she looked overwhelmed by the dinner service, he quietly began helping. Clear plates and refill glasses. It was during dessert that the moment happened, the one that would replay in Sarah's mind for weeks afterward. She was serving her famous tiramisu when David complimented not just the dessert, but her. "Sarah has this incredible gift," he said to the table, his voice warm with admiration. "She doesn't just cook food or arrange flowers or host parties. She creates experiences. She makes people feel welcomed and valued and seen. It's a rare talent." The silence that followed was brief but profound. Sarah felt tears threaten as she realized that David had articulated something she'd never been able to express about herself. The way she poured her heart into caring for others. The way she tried to make everyone around her feel special and appreciated. Michael raised his glass with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "To Sarah," he said, "for making everything beautiful." The toast was lovely, but Sarah couldn't help noticing the difference between her husband's generic praise and David's specific recognition of who she was as a person. Michael saw her as someone who made things beautiful. David saw her as someone who was beautiful, inside and out. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah found herself moving through the motions of farewell hugs and thank you kisses while her mind churned with emotions she couldn't name. She felt grateful for the celebration, guilty about her growing feelings for David, confused about her marriage, and terrified of the conversation she sensed was coming. Because David wasn't leaving. Even as the last guest gathered their coat and headed for the door, he remained seated on the couch, his dark eyes watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You don't have to stay," she told him, though her voice lacked conviction. But David wasn't going anywhere. And deep down, Sarah knew that whatever he was about to say would change everything between them forever. Chapter 3. The moment of truth. The house felt different with just the three of them in it. Sarah, Michael, and David. The energy they had filled the rooms during the party had given way to something more intimate and dangerous. Sarah moved through the kitchen with deliberate focus, washing glasses and putting away leftover food, using the familiar tasks to calm her racing heart. Michael had retreated to his study immediately after the last guest departed, claiming he needed to review documents for an early morning meeting. It was such a predictable response that Sarah barely registered the excuse anymore. Her husband's dedication to his work had long ago stopped feeling like ambition and started feeling like avoidance. That left her alone with David, who sat in the living room with the patience of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. She could feel his presence from the kitchen, could sense his eyes following her movements, could practically hear the words he was gathering the courage to say. "Sarah," he called softly, and something in his voice made her hand still on the dish towel. "Please, come sit with me." She turned slowly, finding him standing now, his tall frame silhouetted against the soft lamplight. He looked different than he had during the party, less composed, more vulnerable. The careful distance he usually maintained between them had dissolved, replaced by something raw and honest that made her breath catch. "David," she started, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I know what you're going to say," he said, taking a step closer. "You're going to tell me that we're friends, that Michael is my best friend, that this is inappropriate. You're going to remind me that you're married, that you're happy, that I'm imagining things." Sarah's lips parted, because those were exactly the words she'd been preparing to say. And as David continued, she realized how hollow they would sound. "But I can't pretend any more, Sarah. I can't sit in this house, watch you light up every room you enter, see you pour your heart into making everyone around you feel special, and pretend that I don single quotes, T. He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. "I can't pretend that I haven't been falling in love with you for the past 3 years." The admission hung between them like a bridge. Neither of them had been brave enough to cross until now. Sarah felt her legs weaken, and she gripped the edge of the counter for support. 3 years? She whispered. David's smile was sad and beautiful. "Do you remember that Christmas party at the Hendersons? You were wearing that green dress, and you spent the entire evening making sure Mrs. Henderson's elderly mother felt included. In the conversations, you sat with her for an hour, listening to stories about her late husband, and you made her feel like the most important person in the room." Sarah remembered that night, though she'd never realized David had been watching. "Ah, that's when I knew," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "That's when I realized that what I felt for you wasn't just friendship or attraction. It was something deeper. You have this incredible capacity for kindness, this way of seeing people, really seeing them. That's so rare. And I knew I was in trouble because you were my best friend's wife. And you seemed happy. And I had no right to feel what I was feeling." "David, let me finish," he said, stepping closer still. "Because I need you to know that I've tried to stay away. I've tried to convince myself that what I see between you and Michael is enough, that you're content with your life, that I'm just projecting my own loneliness onto your marriage. That tonight, watching you at that party, seeing how hard you're, trying to make everything perfect for everyone else. Sarah, when was the last time someone tried to make something perfect for you?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She thought of Michael's perfunctory anniversary gift, expensive earrings he'd clearly asked his assistant to select. She thought of the way he'd barely looked at her during dinner, despite her careful attention to every detail. She thought of how long it had been since anyone had really seen her, had appreciated her efforts, had made her feel valued for who she was rather than what she could do for them. "That's not fair," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" David was close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "When was the last time Michael really looked at you, Sarah? When was the last time he asked about your dreams, your fears, your hopes for the future? When was the last time he made you feel like the incredible woman you are?" Tears stung her eyes because she couldn't answer those questions. Because the truth was that Michael had stopped really seeing her years ago, and she'd been so busy trying to be the perfect wife that she'd forgotten to ask whether he still wanted to be her husband. "I love him," she whispered, though the words felt like a question. "I know you do," David said gently. "And I know he loves you too, in his way." But love isn't enough if it's not paired with attention, with presence, with the daily choice to cherish someone. Sarah, you deserve to be cherished. The sound of a door opening upstairs made them both freeze. Michael's voice drifted down, calling something about going to bed, about the early morning meeting. It was such a normal, domestic sound, but in the context of their conversation, it felt like an intrusion from another world. David stepped back, the spell between them momentarily broken. But his eyes never left her face. "I'm not asking you to leave him," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to blow up your life for me. I'm just asking you to be honest with yourself about what you want, about what you deserve, about whether the life you're living is the life you dreamed of." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at this man who had just turned her world upside down with his honesty. Part of her wanted to run, to retreat into the safe predictability of her marriage, to pretend this conversation had never happened. But a larger part of her, the part that had been quietly suffocating for years, felt like she was breathing freely for the first time in ages. "I need time," she said finally. David nodded, understanding flickering across his features. "I know, and I'll give you all the time you need. But Sarah?" He paused at the threshold between the living room and the front hall. "Don't let fear make the decision for you. Don't let comfort be the enemy of happiness." And then he was gone, leaving Sarah alone with her racing thoughts and the echo of words that had changed everything. The days that followed David's confession passed in a blur of carefully maintained normalcy. Sarah went through the motions of her daily routine: morning coffee with Michael, volunteer work at the animal shelter, grocery shopping, dinner preparation. But everything felt different now, as if she were viewing her life through a lens that had suddenly come into sharp focus. She found herself noticing things she'd trained herself to overlook. The way Michael barely glanced up from his phone when she spoke, how he made plans without consulting her, the mechanical nature of their conversations. It wasn't that he was cruel or dismissive. He was simply absent, going through the motions of marriage without engaging in its deeper intimacy. The leather journal David had given her sat on her nightstand, its pages blank but full of possibility. She'd picked it up a dozen times, pen in hand, but couldn't bring herself to write. What was there to say? That she was falling in love with her husband's best friend. That she felt more alive after one honest conversation with David than she had in years of marriage. That she was terrified of wanting something she couldn't have. It was during her Thursday shift at the animal shelter that she finally found the courage to examine her feelings. She was sitting in the cat room, a purring tabby named Oliver curled in her lap, when her friend and fellow volunteer, Elena, settled beside her with a knowing look. "You've been different this week," Elena observed, her voice gentle but probing. "Distracted. Like you're thinking about something important." Sarah had known Elena for 3 years, had shared countless cups of coffee and conversations about everything, from favorite books to relationship troubles. If anyone could offer perspective on her current situation, it was Elena. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said, her fingers stroking Oliver's soft fur. "How do you know when you're settling in a relationship? When you're accepting less than you deserve?" Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a heavy question for a Thursday afternoon. Are we talking about you and Michael?" Sarah's silence was answer enough. "Ah," Elena said softly. "Well, in my experience, you're settling when you start making excuses for why things are the way they are. When you tell yourself that this is just how relationships work, that passion fades, that you should be grateful for stability, even if it feels like sleepwalking." "But Michael isn't a bad husband," Sarah protested. "He's successful, he's faithful. He provides for us. Sarah," Elena interrupted gently, You're listing his qualities like he's a job candidate, not like he's the love of your life. When was the last time you talked about Michael with joy, with excitement, with that sparkle in your eyes that you get when you talk about travel or books or your dreams? The question hit home because Sarah couldn't remember the last time she'd felt excited about anything related to her marriage. Comfortable, yes. Secure, certainly. But excited? Passionate? Those feelings seemed like memories from another life. There's someone else, Sarah admitted quietly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Not physically, but emotionally, and I can't stop thinking about him. Elena nodded as if she'd been expecting this confession. Want to talk about it? So Sarah told her everything, about David's growing presence in her thoughts, about the way he saw her in ways Michael didn't, about the conversation that had turned her world upside down. She talked about the guilt she felt for having these feelings, the confusion about her marriage, the fear of making the wrong choice. The question isn't whether you have feelings for this other man, Elena said when Sarah finished. The question is whether you're happy in your marriage. Whether you're fulfilled, whether you're growing, whether you feel loved and appreciated for who you are. I don't know anymore, Sarah whispered. I used to think I was happy, but maybe I was just existing. And now? Now I feel like I'm waking up from a very long sleep. That evening, Sarah made dinner with unusual care, preparing Michael's favorite meal and setting the table with candles and their good china. She decided to really try to reconnect with her husband, to give their marriage every chance before she made any decisions about her future. Michael arrived home later than usual, his tie loosened and his face showing the strain of another long day. He paused at the dining room entrance, taking in the romantic setup with surprise. This looks amazing, he said, kissing her cheek. What's the occasion? Does there need to be one? Sarah asked, serving him a glass of wine. I thought it might be nice to have a real dinner together. Just the two of us. They ate in relative quiet, Michael's attention divided between his meal and his phone. Sarah tried to engage him in conversation, asking about his day, sharing a funny story from the animal shelter, mentioning a book she'd been reading. But his responses were distracted, perfunctory, as if he were humoring her rather than truly engaging. Finally, Sarah set down her fork and looked directly at him. Michael, are you happy? The question seemed to startle him. He looked up from his phone, his expression confused. Happy? Of course I'm happy. Why would you ask that? I mean happy with us, with our marriage, with our life together. Michael's face softened, and for a moment, Sarah saw a glimpse of the man she'd fallen in love with. Sarah, of course I'm happy with us. You're an amazing wife. You make our home beautiful. You handle everything so I can focus on work. You're perfect. The word perfect stung because it reduced her to a function rather than acknowledging her as a person. But do you love me? She pressed. Not what I do for you, but who I am? That's a strange question, Michael said, his tone growing defensive. Of course I love you. I married you, didn't I? I work hard to provide for us, to give you a good life. What brought this on? Sarah stared at her husband across the candlelit table and realized that he genuinely didn't understand what she was asking. He loved her the way someone might love a beautiful piece of art or a well-functioning appliance, as something that enhanced his life rather than as a complex, evolving person with her own needs and dreams. Do you know what I want to do with my life? She asked quietly. Beyond being your wife? Michael blinked, clearly struggling with the question. You volunteer at the animal shelter. You like to cook. You've mentioned wanting to travel. I want to write, Sarah said, the words coming out stronger than she'd expected. I want to travel and write about the places I visit, the people I meet. I want to learn Italian and take cooking classes in Tuscany. I want to wake up in the morning excited about the day ahead. That sounds nice, Michael said, but his tone suggested he viewed these as pleasant hobbies rather than serious aspirations. Maybe when I make partner, we can take some longer vacations. And there it was, the fundamental disconnect between them. Michael saw her dreams as accessories to his life. Things that could be accommodated when convenient rather than genuine. Passions that deserved support and encouragement. What if I said I wanted to go to Italy this fall? Sarah asked. What if I said I wanted to rent a small apartment in Florence for a month and write about the experience? Michael's expression shifted, becoming more focused and concerned. This fall? Sarah, that's when the partnership decision comes down. I'll need you here for the firm events, the dinners with clients. This isn't really the time for ... adventures. The word adventures in his mouth sounded like something frivolous, something that could be postponed indefinitely for more important concerns. Sarah felt something inside her chest crack open, a space that had been compressed for so long she'd forgotten it existed. Right, she said quietly. Of course. They finished dinner in near silence, Michael returning to his phone while Sarah cleared the table and tried to process what had just happened. She'd offered her husband a glimpse into her deepest desires, and he dismissed them as inconvenient timing. She'd asked him to see her as more than a supportive wife, and he'd failed to understand the request. As she loaded the dishwasher, Sarah thought about David's words. When was the last time someone tried to make something perfect for you? She'd spent the evening trying to create a perfect moment for Michael, and he'd barely noticed. More importantly, she couldn't remember the last time he'd made such an effort for her. The realization wasn't angry or dramatic. It was simply clear. She and Michael weren't growing apart because of some terrible conflict or betrayal. They were growing apart because they'd never really grown together. They'd built a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt hollow from within. And for the first time in years, Sarah began to imagine what it might feel like to choose happiness over security, passion over comfort, authentic connection over convenient arrangement. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The phone call came on a rainy Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after Sarah's failed attempt to reconnect with Michael. She was sitting in her kitchen, staring at the blank page of David's journal, when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Sarah, this is David. I know I said I'd give you time, but I can't stop thinking about our conversation. Would you be willing to meet me for coffee? No pressure, just ... coffee. Please. Her heart hammered as she read the message. She'd been thinking about him constantly, replaying their conversation, analyzing every word and gesture. The rational part of her mind insisted she should decline, should maintain the boundaries of her marriage, should let this dangerous attraction fade through distance and time. But the part of her that had been awakening over the past weeks, the part that craved authenticity and connection, and the possibility of being truly seen, typed back before she could stop herself. Thursday, 2 p.m. The cafe on Maple Street. The next 2 days passed in a haze of nervous energy. Sarah changed her outfit 3 times on Thursday morning, settling on a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes without seeming like she was trying too hard. She arrived at the cafe early, claiming a corner table where they could talk privately, her hands shaking slightly as she waited. David arrived exactly on time, his hair slightly damp from the rain, his expression uncertain but hopeful. He ordered coffee for both of them, without asking what she wanted, somehow knowing that she preferred a cappuccino with an extra shot, and the small gesture of understanding made her chest tighten with emotion. Thank you for coming, he said, settling into the chair across from her. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure I would either, Sarah admitted. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about what you said. And? Sarah took a shaky breath. And I think you were right. About everything. About me settling, about deserving more, about us. David's eyes widened slightly. Sarah, let me finish, she said, echoing his words from that night. I've been married to Michael for 7 years, and I've spent most of that time convincing myself that what we have is enough. But it's not enough, David. I'm not happy. I haven't been happy for a long time, and I've been too scared to admit it. What are you saying? I'm saying that I've been falling in love with you too. Maybe not for 3 years, but definitely for the past few months. I'm saying that you see me in ways my own husband doesn't, that you make me feel alive and valued and understood. I'm saying that I can't keep pretending otherwise. The silence that followed was charged with possibility and fear. David reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers, and the simple contact sent electricity through her entire body. I love you, he said quietly. I love your kindness, your creativity, your strength. I love the way you light up when you talk about your dreams. I love how you make everyone around you feel special. And I hate that you've been settling for less than you deserve. Tears pricked Sarah's eyes. I love you too. But I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how to be the kind of person who leaves her marriage for another man. You're not leaving your marriage for me, David said gently. You're leaving it for yourself, for the woman you were meant to be, for the life you were meant to live. I just happen to be someone who can see that woman and love her completely. They talked for 2 hours, sharing dreams and fears, exploring the possibility of a future together. David told her about his own loneliness, about the way he'd watched her marriage from the outside, and wished he could give her what she needed. Sarah talked about her writing aspirations, about the Italy trip she'd mentioned to Michael, about the person she'd been before marriage had made her smaller and more careful. Come with me, she said suddenly, the words surprising them both. To Italy. I'm going to book that trip to Florence, and I want you to come with me. David's expression grew serious. Sarah, you need to think about this. Really think about it. Once we cross this line, there's no going back. I know, she said, and she did know. She knew that leaving with David would mean the end of her marriage, the end of the life she'd built with Michael, the end of the safety and security she'd clung to for so long. But she also knew that staying would mean the end of her dreams, her authenticity, her chance at real happiness. I'm 42 years old, she continued. I've spent the last 7 years being the perfect wife, and I'm tired of being perfect. I want to be real. I want to be happy. I want to be with someone who loves me for who I am, not what I can do for them. David squeezed her hand. What about Michael? Sarah's heart ached at the thought of her husband. Despite everything she did love him, though she'd come to understand that love without deep connection, without mutual growth, without genuine partnership, wasn't enough to sustain a marriage. I'll talk to him, she said. I owe him that much. I owe him honesty about where I am, about what I need, about why this isn't working. And if he fights for you, if he promises to change. Sarah considered this, remembering their dinner conversation, the way Michael had dismissed her dreams as poorly timed hobbies. Then I'll know I made the right choice in leaving, she said. Because fighting for someone means understanding what they need, not just promising to give them what you think they should want. They left the cafe together, walking slowly through the rain-dampened streets. At the corner where their paths diverged, David pulled her into his arms, and Sarah finally allowed herself to feel the full force of her attraction to him. His kiss was gentle but passionate, full of promise and possibility. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "I love you too," she replied, and for the first time in years, the words felt like a beginning rather than an ending. Epilogue. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the terrace of her small apartment in Florence, watching the sun set over the Arno River. The leather journal David had given her lay open on the wrought iron table, its pages now filled with stories and observations, sketches and dreams. She'd been in Italy for 3 months, and every day felt like a gift. The conversation with Michael had been one of the hardest things she'd ever done. She'd expected anger, accusations, demands for explanations. Instead, she'd found a man who was genuinely shocked to learn that she'd been unhappy, who'd somehow missed the signs of her dissatisfaction despite living with her for 7 years. "I thought you were happy," he'd said, his voice small and confused. "I thought I was being a good husband." "You were being the husband you thought I wanted," Sarah had replied gently. "But neither of us ever asked what I actually needed." The divorce proceedings had been surprisingly amicable. Michael had kept the house. Sarah had taken her books and her dreams, and they'd both acknowledged that they'd grown into incompatible people who deserved better than the marriage they'd built. David had joined her in Florence after the first month, taking a sabbatical from his teaching position to write and explore Europe with her. They'd rented bicycles and cycled through Tuscany, had taken cooking classes with an elderly Italian woman who'd adopted them as honorary grandchildren, had spent hours in museums and cafes, talking about art and literature and the future they were building together. Their relationship was different from what Sarah had expected. There was passion, yes, but also a deep friendship, a mutual respect for each other's dreams and ambitions. David encouraged her writing, celebrated her small victories, and gave her the space to discover who she was outside of marriage and societal expectations.